Your daughter is mentally unfit to manage $4 million, Richard Harper said calmly across the polished oak conference table, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than attempting to dismantle his own child's life. Evelyn Harper did not blink. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of the downtown Chicago law office, casting long golden stripes across the leather chairs and the framed certificates on the wall. She sat perfectly upright, her black wool coat still buttoned, her gloved hands resting lightly in her lap. At 67, newly widowed, she looked composed, too composed, perhaps, for the narrative her parents were trying to construct. Her mother, Linda, leaned forward with a sigh rehearsed to sound maternal. "We're only concerned about her well-being," she told the attorney, Mark Bennett, who nodded sympathetically. "After James passed, she hasn't been herself." Evelyn's gaze shifted briefly to the folder in front of her. The words petition for guardianship were printed neatly at the top. She had received a copy only 48 hours earlier, delivered by certified mail to the 8,000-square-foot lakefront home she had shared with her husband for 32 years. The home that now echoed with absence. The home her parents had admired at the funeral reception with quiet, measuring eyes. "Grief can impair judgment," Mark continued, folding his hands. "Managing a $4 million estate requires clarity." $4 million. The number hung in the air like a verdict. James Harper, a disciplined investor and founder of a regional construction firm, had structured his estate meticulously. Every account, every asset, every share of stock transferred directly to Evelyn. It had been his decision, documented and witnessed. But now her own parents were suggesting that she lacked the mental capacity to oversee it. Evelyn felt the faintest tightening in her chest, not from panic, but from recognition. This was not concern. It was strategy. She remembered the way her father had asked, just days after the burial, whether she planned to keep all that property. The way her mother had inquired about her medications, about whether she was sleeping. At the time, Evelyn had answered plainly. She had nothing to hide. Now she understood those questions had not been casual. They had been groundwork. "Evelyn," Linda said softly, reaching across the table but stopping short of contact. "We're trying to protect you." Protect her? From what? From the responsibility her husband trusted her to carry? From the life she had built beside him? She could hear the faint hum of traffic 10 floors below, the steady rhythm of the city continuing without regard for family betrayal. Daniel Cross, James's longtime attorney, sat quietly at her side. He had warned her this meeting might take an unexpected turn. Still, hearing the accusation spoken aloud felt surreal. Mentally unfit. The phrase was clinical, cold, almost antiseptic. It stripped away decades of competence in 2 words. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice even, almost gentle. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Richard cleared his throat. "Temporary guardianship. Until the court is satisfied you're stable." Stable. The implication was deliberate. A widow. Alone. Overwhelmed. She could almost see the image they were painting. But Evelyn Harper had spent 30 years managing gallery acquisitions, negotiating contracts, overseeing multi-million-dollar transactions long before her husband's passing. She had balanced books while raising a daughter, chaired nonprofit boards, filed joint tax returns without error. She was not unstable. She was observant. And she was prepared. Her eyes moved once more to the leather briefcase at her feet. Inside it lay copies of medical evaluations completed only weeks prior at her primary physician's request, routine, thorough, affirming full cognitive health. There were also printed emails, timestamps intact, and a small digital recorder containing a conversation her parents did not realize she had preserved. Evelyn folded her hands over one another and met her father's gaze. They believed grief had weakened her. They believed isolation had made her vulnerable. What they did not yet understand was that silence was not surrender. It was calculation. The conference room emptied slowly after the meeting, but Evelyn Harper remained seated until the hallway outside grew quiet. Daniel Cross closed his leather portfolio with deliberate care and gave her a look that held both concern and respect. He had known her husband for more than 2 decades and had come to understand that calm in this family never meant weakness. When they finally stepped into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected a woman who looked composed, almost detached, yet her mind was working with precise clarity. Outside, the late autumn air carried the sharp edge of Lake Michigan, and the city moved around her in steady rhythm, unaware that her own parents had just attempted to strip her of legal autonomy. The drive back to the lakefront house took 20 minutes, but the silence inside the car felt heavier than the traffic along Lakeshore Drive. She watched familiar storefronts pass by, remembering how James used to comment on new developments rising along the skyline. It had been only 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks since she had stood beside his casket at St. Andrew Parish, greeting business partners and distant relatives who spoke in hushed tones about legacy and leadership. Her parents had stood beside her that day, offering gentle smiles and firm embraces, speaking about strength and family unity. She remembered her mother's hand resting just a little too long on the banister as they toured the foyer afterward, her father's quiet whistle when he looked at the custom oak staircase. At the time, Evelyn had assumed they were overwhelmed by the scale of the house. Now she understood they had been calculating. The security gate opened automatically as her car approached, and she parked inside the circular driveway lined with dormant rose bushes James had planted 15 years earlier. The house felt different now, not because it was empty, but because its walls seemed to carry the weight of scrutiny. She stepped inside and removed her coat slowly, placing it on the antique hall tree. Every surface in the foyer was immaculate. The marble floors reflected the soft chandelier light. There was no sign of disorder, no evidence of instability. Yet somewhere in a courthouse filing system, a document suggested she could not be trusted to manage her own affairs. She walked into James's study, the room that still held the faint scent of cedar and old books. His mahogany desk remained exactly as he had left it. The framed photograph of the two of them at their 30th anniversary dinner sat angled toward the chair. Evelyn lowered herself into that chair and opened her briefcase. She laid out the medical evaluations first, each page stamped and signed, confirming cognitive clarity and emotional stability. Then she placed the printed emails beside them, carefully aligning the edges. The language in those messages was subtle but unmistakable. Discussions about timing, references to vulnerability, suggestions that grief might be leveraged in court. Finally, she set the small digital recorder on the desk and pressed play just long enough to hear her father's voice from 2 nights earlier, speaking to her mother in the kitchen, unaware that she had stepped into the hallway. They had believed she was upstairs resting. They had spoken about guardianship as if it were already decided. Evelyn turned the device off and folded her hands. Grief had sharpened her perception rather than dulled it. She had listened. She had observed. And while her parents prepared to argue that she was incapable, she was assembling something far more durable than emotion. She was assembling proof. The following morning, Evelyn Harper rose at 6:30 as she had every weekday for more than 3 decades. Routine, she believed, was not a sign of fragility but of discipline. She brewed a single cup of black coffee in the stainless steel machine James had insisted on buying during a renovation 5 years earlier, measured precisely, no sugar, no cream. The kitchen overlooked the quiet gray stretch of Lake Michigan, and the horizon line felt steady, unwavering. She carried her mug to the breakfast nook and opened her leather planner. There were appointments to confirm, financial statements to review, and a scheduled call with Daniel Cross at 9 o'clock. Outside, a delivery truck passed along the street, its engine humming evenly. The world had not tilted. Only her understanding of her parents had. She replayed their tone from the previous afternoon, not the words alone but the cadence beneath them. Concern layered over control. Sympathy masking entitlement. Richard had spoken about stability, but his eyes had lingered on numbers. Linda had spoken about protection, yet her hand had trembled not from fear for her daughter, but from anticipation. Evelyn finished her coffee and moved to the study again, spreading the documents across the desk with methodical precision. She examined the guardianship petition more carefully now, noting the phrasing that suggested diminished capacity without offering concrete examples. It referenced grief, emotional distress, and an alleged inability to manage complex investments. The language was broad, almost generic. It read less like an observation and more like a template. Daniel had explained that such filings required supporting statements. Someone would have to attest to instability. Someone would have to claim they had witnessed erratic behavior. Evelyn considered the last 3 weeks with deliberate clarity. She had hosted a memorial reception without incident. She had paid invoices for funeral services totaling $23,000 without delay. She had transferred utilities into her sole name, reviewed life insurance payouts, and met with the chief financial officer of James's company to discuss quarterly projections. None of those actions reflected confusion. None suggested incapacity. Yet she knew perception in court could be shaped carefully. A widow alone in a large house could be painted as overwhelmed. A quiet demeanor could be framed as withdrawal. She opened her laptop and accessed the home security system, scrolling through archived footage from 2 nights earlier. There it was. Her parents seated at the kitchen island after dinner, unaware that the ceiling microphone captured more than ambient sound. Richard's voice was low but clear enough. He spoke about timing, about acting before Evelyn regained her footing. Linda mentioned consulting an attorney who specialized in conservatorship. Evelyn paused the video and leaned back in James's chair. The evidence was not dramatic. It was subtle, practical, almost bureaucratic. But it revealed intent. At 9 o'clock sharp, her phone rang. Daniel's voice was steady on the other end. He informed her that the court had scheduled an initial review hearing in 3 weeks. There would be an independent psychological evaluation ordered by the judge. Evelyn listened carefully and then asked a single question about procedural timelines. When the call ended, she placed the phone face down on the desk. 3 weeks was not a threat. It was an opportunity. Her parents believed grief had clouded her judgment. They had mistaken quiet for surrender. What they did not see was the precision behind her calm. She was not reacting. She was preparing. 3 days after the court date was set, Evelyn Harper drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital for the independent evaluation the judge had ordered. The building rose in clean lines of glass and steel against a pale November sky, efficient and clinical, much like the process her parents had initiated. She arrived 15 minutes early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. Time, she believed, reflected discipline. In the waiting area, muted news played on a wall-mounted television while patients flipped through outdated magazines. Evelyn sat upright, hands folded over her structured leather handbag, observing without appearing to. When her name was called, she followed a nurse down a quiet hallway into a softly lit office where Dr. Melissa Collins introduced herself with professional warmth. The evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. Dr. Collins asked about memory, daily routines, financial management, emotional state. She requested specific dates, figures, and recent decisions. Evelyn answered calmly, providing exact numbers when asked about investment allocations, recalling account balances within a margin of less than 1%, describing how she had restructured certain holdings after James's passing to reduce risk exposure. She spoke about grief without dramatics. She acknowledged sleepless nights, but described how she had resumed her morning walks along the lake and maintained scheduled meetings. There was no defensiveness in her tone, only clarity. At one point, Dr. Collins asked how she felt about her parents' petition. Evelyn paused, not because she was unsure, but because she chose her words carefully. She stated that she believed the filing was financially motivated. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse with emotion. She simply referenced the timing of their inquiries about asset distribution and their recent consultations with attorneys specializing in guardianship law. Dr. Collins made notes without interruption. When the session ended, the doctor extended her hand and said the report would be submitted directly to the court within 10 business days. Evelyn stepped back into the hospital lobby feeling neither relieved nor anxious. She felt measured. In the parking garage, she sat inside her car for a moment before turning the ignition, reviewing the morning in her mind the way she used to review gallery contracts before signing. There had been no missteps, no inconsistencies. Later that afternoon, her parents called. The timing was precise, almost strategic. Linda's voice carried that familiar softness, asking how the appointment had gone. Richard took the phone midway through the conversation and remarked that these evaluations were for the best. Evelyn listened more than she spoke. She answered briefly, offering nothing that could be reframed. When the call ended, she placed the phone on the kitchen counter and stood still, allowing the silence of the house to settle around her. The marble floors, the framed photographs, the carefully catalogued files in James's study all testified to a life built with intention. Incapacity would have left cracks. There were none. She walked back into the study and added a new folder to the growing stack on the desk labeled Court Evidence. Inside it she placed the appointment confirmation, a printed summary of the evaluation process, and her own written account of every question asked and every answer given. If her parents believed the path to control ran through doubt, they were mistaken. Every step they took to question her stability only provided another opportunity for her to demonstrate it. The week before the preliminary hearing unfolded with a quiet precision that contrasted sharply with the accusation hanging over Evelyn Harper's name. Each morning, she rose at the same hour, reviewed the same financial dashboards on her encrypted tablet, and updated the ledger she had maintained since the day James had insisted she understand every asset they owned. The estate was not abstract to her. It was detailed. Diversified municipal bonds totaling $1.2 million. Commercial real estate holdings valued at $1.8 million. Long-term equity investments fluctuating daily, but documented to the cent. She knew the structure of it the way other people knew recipes passed down through generations. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel Cross arrived at the lakefront house carrying a slim briefcase and a gravity that suggested new information. They sat in James's study beneath the tall built-in shelves, sunlight cutting across the Persian rug. Daniel removed a set of printed bank statements and laid them on the desk beside the growing stack of court documents. These were subpoenaed in anticipation of the hearing, he explained. The transfers were subtle. $40,000 labeled as consulting fees. $25,000 categorized as advisory services. All routed to a firm Evelyn did not recognize. The dates corresponded precisely with the week after James's funeral. Evelyn studied the numbers without visible reaction. The firm is connected to Mark Bennett's extended partnership network, Daniel continued carefully. The implication did not require elaboration. Money had moved before any court ruling, before any determination of her capacity. She leaned back in the leather chair and considered the pattern. Her father had always been deliberate with finances, conservative even. He did not authorize large transfers impulsively. If funds were moving through legal channels, it meant strategy had been set in motion well before the guardianship petition reached her mailbox. That realization did not frighten her. It clarified the timeline. She walked to the window, overlooking the water, and folded her arms lightly, watching a sailboat glide along the gray surface of the lake. James had once told her that wealth did not change character. It revealed it. The past month now felt less like a period of mourning and more like an audit of loyalty. Her parents had asked about account access under the guise of assistance. They had suggested simplifying holdings for her peace of mind. She had declined politely at the time, believing boundaries were sufficient. Now she understood that politeness had been interpreted as weakness. Turning back toward the desk, she asked Daniel one question about the legal standard required to prove bad faith in a guardianship filing. He answered in measured detail, outlining the burden of evidence and the potential consequences if intent to exploit could be demonstrated. Evelyn nodded once. The path ahead was becoming structured. She gathered the bank statements and placed them into a new folder labeled Financial Transfers. The label was written in clean, even handwriting. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. Outside, the lake continued its steady rhythm against the shoreline. Inside the study, beneath the quiet tick of the antique clock James had restored years ago, Evelyn Harper recognized that the petition against her was no longer merely an accusation of instability. It was documentation of motive. And motive, when traced carefully, could unravel everything her parents believed they had secured. 2 weeks before the hearing, a certified envelope arrived at the lakefront house just after noon. Evelyn Harper signed for it herself, her signature steady across the digital pad. The return address bore the letterhead of the law firm representing her parents. She carried the envelope into James's study without opening it immediately. Instead, she placed it on the desk beside the neatly arranged folders and removed her gloves with deliberate care. Outside, the sky had shifted into a pale winter gray, the surface of Lake Michigan restless under the wind. Inside, the house remained orderly, controlled. She slit the envelope open with a brass letter opener James had once received as a retirement gift from a business associate. The document inside was a supplemental affidavit. It contained sworn statements describing her as withdrawn, emotionally volatile, incapable of making sound financial decisions. The language was polished but distant, as though written by someone who had observed her from across a room rather than lived within her daily routine. She read each paragraph slowly, not skimming, not reacting outwardly. It referenced her silence at the funeral as evidence of instability. It described her refusal to grant her parents joint access to certain accounts as paranoia. It implied that her decision to remain in the 8,000-square-foot home alone suggested impaired judgment. Evelyn set the pages down and allowed a single breath to escape evenly through her nose. The strategy was becoming transparent. Normal grief was being reframed as dysfunction. Boundaries were being characterized as delusion. She rose from the desk and walked into the hallway where framed photographs documented decades of family gatherings. There was one from a 4th of July barbecue 10 years earlier. Her parents smiling beside James, arms linked, pride evident. She studied that image for a moment, not with sadness, but with analysis. People rarely reveal intent when circumstances are comfortable. It surfaces when opportunity appears. Returning to the study, she opened the digital recorder again and replayed a brief segment of the kitchen conversation captured days earlier. Her father's voice mentioned, convincing the court before she stabilizes. The phrase was precise. It implied an expectation that her current state was temporary and exploitable. Evelyn connected the recorder to her laptop and backed up the file to an encrypted drive. Then she drafted a detailed timeline of events beginning the day after James's funeral. Dates, conversations, financial transfers. Each entry factual, unemotional. At 4 o'clock, Daniel Cross called with confirmation that the psychological evaluation report had been completed. The findings were unequivocal. Cognitively intact, financially competent, emotionally stable within normal parameters of bereavement. Evelyn listened without visible relief. Stability was not something she felt compelled to prove to herself. It was something she intended to demonstrate methodically in court. After ending the call, she placed the affidavit from her parents into a separate folder labeled allegations. The contrast between that folder and the one labeled evidence was becoming increasingly stark. One contained claims built on interpretation. The other contained records anchored in data. As dusk settled over the lake and the first interior lights reflected against the windows, Evelyn Harper understood that the narrative her parents were constructing relied on perception. The narrative she was assembling relied on documentation. And documentation, presented clearly, had a way of outlasting assumption. The night before the preliminary hearing, the lakefront house stood in absolute stillness, its tall windows reflecting the faint glow of streetlights along the shore. Evelyn Harper sat alone at James's mahogany desk, the folders arranged in exact order across its polished surface. Allegations to the left, evidence to the right. The symmetry was intentional. Order had always brought clarity to her thinking. She opened the folder labeled allegations once more and reread the sworn statements submitted by her parents. Words such as unstable, impaired judgment, emotional fragility appeared repeatedly, as though repetition could substitute for proof. She did not react to the language. Instead, she measured it. Each claim lacked a specific incident. There were no documented financial losses, no missed payments, no irrational transactions. Only interpretation. She closed the folder and shifted her attention to the evidence she had assembled over the past weeks. The medical evaluation from Dr. Collins was placed on top, its conclusion direct and professionally worded. Beneath it rested bank statements detailing the consulting transfers connected to the opposing counsel's network. Below that lay printed email exchanges containing references to timing and leverage. Finally, the encrypted drive containing the recorded kitchen conversation sat at the center of the desk like a quiet anchor. Evelyn did not feel anger. What she felt was recognition. The hearing scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning was not about her mental capacity. It was about narrative control. If her parents could convince the court that she was overwhelmed, then temporary guardianship would follow. With guardianship would come access. With access would come authority over $4 million in diversified assets and properties that James had spent a lifetime building. She rose from the chair and walked slowly through the hallway, pausing before the large portrait taken at their 25th anniversary celebration. James had insisted on hiring a photographer that evening, joking that milestones deserved documentation. Documentation. The word lingered in her mind. That was what separated perception from fact. Returning to the study, she prepared a single leather binder for the court appearance, placing only the most essential documents inside. She removed anything unnecessary. Excess invited distraction. Precision invited credibility. At 8:30 that evening, her phone vibrated with a message from Linda asking if she would like to have dinner together after the hearing. No matter how things turn out. The phrasing was careful, conditional. Evelyn read the message once and set the phone face down without responding. Dinner implied reconciliation. Reconciliation implied misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was strategy. She turned off the desk lamp and allowed the room to settle into shadow. Tomorrow would not be dramatic. There would be no raised voices, no theatrical gestures. There would be documents presented, questions asked, and credibility weighed. Her parents believed they had framed her silence as weakness. They had mistaken restraint for collapse. As the house grew quiet and the wind brushed against the windows overlooking the lake, Evelyn Harper understood that the most powerful rebuttal would not come from emotion. It would come from evidence presented calmly, one page at a time. The morning of the hearing arrived without spectacle. The courthouse stood in measured silence beneath a pale winter sky, its stone columns reflecting the cold light of early December. Evelyn Harper stepped from her car precisely at 9:30, her charcoal coat tailored, her posture upright, the leather binder held securely in her left hand. There was no hesitation in her pace as she entered through the revolving doors and passed through security. Inside the courtroom, the air carried the quiet hum of administrative routine. A clerk organized files behind the bench. Two attorneys reviewed notes at separate tables. Across the room, Richard and Linda Harper sat side by side, their expressions composed, almost sympathetic to an uninformed observer. When their eyes met Evelyn's, there was a brief flicker of expectation, as though they anticipated visible strain. She offered neither smile nor hostility, only acknowledgement. Daniel Cross stood as she approached, greeting her with a small nod that conveyed readiness rather than reassurance. The judge entered promptly at 10 o'clock, and the room rose in unison before settling again into wooden benches polished by decades of similar proceedings. Mark Bennett spoke first, outlining concerns about Evelyn's emotional state following bereavement. He referenced the size of the estate, the complexity of financial management, and the supposed need for temporary oversight in the interest of protection. His tone was measured, almost compassionate. The petition was framed not as accusation, but as precaution. When it was Daniel's turn, he did not challenge with theatrics. He presented documentation. The psychological evaluation report was submitted into evidence first. Its conclusion read clearly into the record: cognitively intact, financially competent, emotionally stable within expected parameters of grief. There was no ambiguity in the language. Next came the bank statements, detailing transfers labeled as consulting fees that predated any court determination. The judge's expression shifted slightly at the mention of dates aligning with private discussions about guardianship. Finally, Daniel requested permission to submit a recorded conversation relevant to intent. The courtroom remained quiet as a short excerpt was played, Richard's voice discussing timing and leverage. There was no raised volume in the recording. No overt confession, only calculated phrasing that suggested anticipation of advantage. Evelyn remained still throughout, her hands resting lightly on the table. She did not glance at her parents as the audio concluded. She did not display satisfaction. She simply waited. When the judge addressed the petitioners directly, asking for clarification regarding financial transfers and strategic language, Richard's composure thinned. Linda shifted in her seat, offering explanations about concern and misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding appeared again. The judge listened, then turned back to the documents laid out in ordered sequence. Evidence did not rely on tone. It relied on consistency. After a pause that felt longer than it likely was, the judge stated that the petition for guardianship was denied pending further review of the financial transactions submitted. The matter of intent would be examined separately. The gavel struck once, firm but not dramatic. As the courtroom began to empty, Evelyn closed her binder and rose from her chair. She did not look toward her parents. She did not speak. The narrative that had been constructed around her instability had been met not with emotion, but with documentation. And documentation, presented calmly under oath, had shifted the balance. The courthouse steps were colder than the air suggested, the stone holding the chill of early winter as Evelyn Harper descended with steady, measured steps. Reporters were not waiting. There were no cameras, no spectacle. The hearing had not been dramatic enough to attract headlines. It had simply been procedural, yet the shift that had taken place inside that courtroom was undeniable. Richard and Linda exited several minutes later, walking close together but not speaking. Richard's jaw appeared set in restrained frustration, while Linda's expression carried a strain that no longer resembled maternal concern. They did not approach Evelyn. They did not offer dinner. The conditional kindness from the night before had dissolved under the weight of evidence. Daniel Cross paused beside her near the bottom of the steps and spoke in a low, professional tone. The judge's denial of the guardianship petition was immediate, but the review of financial transfers would continue. If impropriety were established, the consequences could extend beyond embarrassment. Evelyn listened carefully, then nodded once. She thanked him for his diligence, not with effusive gratitude, but with quiet acknowledgement. Inside her car, she allowed herself a single exhale. Before turning the key in the ignition, the city traffic resumed its familiar rhythm as she merged onto Lakeshore Drive. The skyline rose ahead, steel and glass reflecting the gray afternoon light. Stability, structure, systems built to withstand pressure. The parallels were not lost on her. Back at the house, the security gate closed behind her with a soft mechanical hum. The driveway remained undisturbed. The rose bushes lining the walkway had shed their final leaves. Inside, the foyer greeted her with the same measured stillness it had offered every evening since James's passing. Nothing in the physical space had shifted, yet something fundamental had clarified. She placed her binder on the study desk and removed the documents one by one, returning them to their designated folders. Allegations, evidence, financial transfers. The labels remained unchanged, but their weight felt different. The narrative questioning her capacity had been publicly countered. Not through anger, not through spectacle, through documentation. As she organized the papers, her phone vibrated with a voicemail notification. It was Richard. His message was brief and tightly controlled. He stated that they had acted only out of concern and that perhaps matters had escalated unnecessarily. The word unnecessarily lingered after the message ended. Evelyn did not return the call. Concern did not require covert financial transfers. Protection did not require recorded discussions about leverage. She walked toward the large windows overlooking Lake Michigan and watched the late afternoon light fade into early dusk. Waves moved steadily against the shoreline, consistent and indifferent to human conflict. The hearing had not ended the matter entirely. The investigation into financial conduct would proceed. There would be questions answered under oath. But one fact was no longer in dispute. She was not unstable. She was not incapable. And the attempt to redefine her identity for financial access had met resistance grounded not in emotion, but in proof. As the house settled into evening quiet, Evelyn Harper understood that the most profound victory was not the denial of guardianship. It was the restoration of her credibility in a room where it had been deliberately questioned. And credibility, once affirmed in open court, carried a weight no accusation could easily displace. The investigation into the financial transfers began quietly, without the spectacle of a courtroom, but with far greater consequence. 3 days after the hearing, Daniel Cross called to inform Evelyn Harper that the judge had authorized a formal review of the consulting payments connected to the guardianship filing. The inquiry would examine whether funds had been moved in anticipation of gaining control over her estate. Evelyn listened in silence, seated once again at James's mahogany desk, the late afternoon sun casting long reflections across the polished wood. There was no sense of triumph in her expression, only awareness that actions, once documented, rarely remain contained. Later that week, a certified request for documentation was delivered to her parents' residence. Financial records, communication logs, and partnership agreements were now subject to scrutiny. Richard called again that evening, his tone measured but strained. He suggested that perhaps legal counsel had acted independently. He implied that fees were standard in complex estate matters. Evelyn did not challenge him over the phone. She did not accuse. She simply asked one question about whether he had authorized the transfers personally. There was a pause long enough to reveal more than his words did. He answered that decisions had been made in consultation. Consultation. The word echoed the language of the affidavit. She thanked him for clarifying and ended the call. In the days that followed, she continued her routines uninterrupted. She met with the chief financial officer of James's former company to review quarterly performance. She attended a scheduled board meeting for the Arts Foundation she had chaired for years. Her presence was steady, her contributions precise. No one in those rooms would have described her as unstable. Meanwhile, the inquiry deepened. Bank timestamps showed that certain payments had been processed hours after private discussions about leveraging vulnerability. Email metadata confirmed coordination between legal representatives before the petition was formally filed. Daniel forwarded summaries as they became available, each one reinforcing a pattern. Evelyn did not celebrate each development. She cataloged them. The house remained orderly. The lake continued its steady rhythm beyond the windows. One evening, as she reviewed updated reports, she reflected on the distinction between grief and incapacity. Grief had altered her days, yes. It had made mornings quieter and evenings heavier. But it had not impaired her judgment. If anything, it had sharpened her perception of motive. The attempt to redefine her identity in court had underestimated the discipline she had cultivated over decades. Near the end of the week, Daniel informed her that opposing counsel had requested a private settlement discussion. The guardianship petition had already been denied, but the financial review threatened reputational consequences. Evelyn considered the request carefully. Settlement implied compromise. Compromise implied shared fault. She asked Daniel whether the documentation clearly demonstrated intent. He answered that the evidence was persuasive. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, watching the final light fade over Lake Michigan. The waves did not negotiate with the shoreline. They followed a pattern governed by force and gravity. Turning back toward the desk, she gave her decision. There would be no quiet settlement. The facts would proceed through formal review. Her credibility had been questioned publicly. The restoration of truth would follow the same path. And this time, it would not be framed as misunderstanding. It would be recorded as record. The following Monday, the formal review expanded beyond financial transfers and into sworn depositions. Evelyn Harper arrived at Daniel Cross's office at 9 o'clock sharp, dressed in a navy wool suit that reflected neither defiance nor submission. The deposition room was smaller than the courtroom, but carried a similar gravity. A court reporter adjusted her machine at the end of the table, while opposing counsel organized folders with deliberate care. Richard and Linda Harper entered together, their posture restrained, their expressions carefully neutral. This was no longer about guardianship. It was about accountability. The questioning began with procedural matters, confirmation of names, dates, and representation. Then the focus shifted to the consulting payments. Mark Bennett was asked to clarify the nature of the advisory services rendered. He described them as preparatory legal assessments. When pressed for documentation detailing deliverables, he referenced internal memoranda. Copies were requested. Richard was asked directly whether he had authorized the transfers before or after filing the petition. He stated that he had relied on professional guidance. The phrasing remained consistent. Guidance, consultation, protection. Each term carried the tone of concern while sidestepping intent. Evelyn observed without interruption, seated beside Daniel with her hands folded neatly over a leather notebook. She did not interject. She did not allow visible reaction to shape the room. When it was her turn to answer questions, she spoke evenly. She confirmed the timeline of her husband's passing, the date the petition was received, and the sequence of financial transfers as outlined in the subpoenaed statements. She described her daily routines, her management of diversified assets, and her decision to decline joint account access. Her voice did not waver. The court reporter's machine captured each word with mechanical precision. At one point, opposing counsel asked whether she felt resentment toward her parents. Evelyn paused briefly before answering. She stated that the matter before the review was financial conduct, not personal emotion. The distinction was subtle but powerful. It redirected the focus away from narrative and back toward evidence. Hours later, when the deposition concluded, the room felt heavier than when it began. Not from confrontation, but from documentation. Statements had been entered into record under oath. Dates had been aligned. Language had been preserved verbatim. As Richard and Linda gathered their coats, there was no attempt at eye contact. The controlled sympathy from earlier weeks had given way to guarded silence. Outside, the late afternoon air carried the sharp clarity of approaching winter. Evelyn walked to her car with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Daniel informed her that the review panel would compile findings within 14 business days. If misrepresentation or financial manipulation were confirmed, sanctions could follow. Evelyn nodded once. The process had shifted from accusation to examination. An examination, when conducted under oath and recorded line by line, had a way of exposing intention without the need for raised voices. As she drove back toward the lakefront house, the skyline appeared crisp against the fading light. Structures built on solid foundations endured scrutiny. Structures built on assumption did not. The distinction was no longer theoretical. It was being transcribed. 14 business days passed with a steady rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself were allowing documentation to settle into place. Evelyn Harper did not mark the days on a calendar, yet she was aware of each one. She continued attending meetings, reviewing quarterly reports, and maintaining the estate ledger with the same discipline she had practiced for years. The lake outside her windows shifted from gray to silver to deep winter blue, but inside the house nothing felt unstable. On the morning the findings were scheduled to be released, Daniel Cross called at 9:15. His voice carried a quiet finality. The review panel had concluded that the financial transfers associated with the guardianship petition were executed in anticipation of potential control over the estate and had not been disclosed transparently to the court. The language in the report was measured, but its implication was unmistakable. The consulting fees lacked sufficient justification, and the coordination between petitioners and counsel raised ethical concerns. Evelyn listened without interruption. She asked one clarifying question about whether the findings would become part of the public record. Daniel confirmed that they would. There would be no sealed summary, no quiet amendment. The conclusions would stand within the official file. That afternoon, a formal notice was delivered to her parents' legal representative outlining potential sanctions and a recommendation for disciplinary review. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public apology. Instead, there was silence. Richard did not call. Linda did not send a message framed in concern. The absence of outreach spoke more clearly than words might have. Evelyn placed the printed findings inside a new folder labeled Panel Conclusion and slid it into the cabinet where the earlier allegations were stored. The distinction between the folders had solidified. One had attempted to redefine her capacity. The other had documented motive. She walked slowly through the hallway of framed photographs once more, pausing at the image from her anniversary celebration. The woman in that photograph had trusted that family meant protection. The woman standing in the quiet lakefront home now understood that trust required verification. As evening approached, she sat in James's study and opened the estate ledger. Numbers remained consistent. Investments remained diversified. The $4 million her parents had claimed she could not manage were intact and precisely accounted for. She closed the ledger and looked toward the window where the lake reflected the fading light. The attempt to question her competence had not diminished her standing. It had revealed something else entirely. Stability was not declared. It was demonstrated. And in rooms where accusations had once been spoken with calculated sympathy, documentation had replaced narrative. Evelyn Harper did not feel vindicated in a theatrical sense. She felt steady. The process had moved from suspicion to scrutiny to record. And in the official record, her name was no longer accompanied by doubt. It was accompanied by findings. In the weeks that followed the panel's conclusion, the silence from Richard and Linda Harper settled into something heavier than confrontation. There were no further calls framed as concern, no invitations to dinner offered with careful wording. The distance was deliberate. Evelyn Harper did not attempt to close it. Instead, she redirected her attention towards something that had remained quietly in the background throughout the ordeal. James had once spoken about establishing a structured charitable foundation in their later years, a way to channel a portion of their estate into arts education programs across Chicago public schools. At the time, the idea had been postponed, overshadowed by business expansion and travel. Now, seated in his study beneath the tall shelves of legal and financial volumes, Evelyn reopened the folder marked Philanthropic Planning that had not been touched in nearly 3 years. The documents were thorough but incomplete. James had drafted preliminary outlines allocating $500,000 over a 10-year period to fund art supplies, scholarships, and visiting artist residencies in underserved districts. He had written in the margins with precise handwriting, noting that cultural access was not a luxury, but a stabilizing force. Evelyn traced her finger lightly over those notes, recognizing the clarity in his intent. The estate remained intact. $4 million diversified across investments, properties, and reserves. Her management had not faltered under scrutiny. If anything, it had strengthened. She contacted the firm's financial advisor and scheduled a formal consultation to revisit the philanthropic structure. The meeting took place at a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Chicago River, the skyline reflecting in measured symmetry. She outlined her intention to create the James Harper Arts Initiative with an initial endowment of $750,000, funded directly from liquid assets without jeopardizing long-term estate growth. The advisor reviewed projections and confirmed sustainability. The numbers aligned. Back at the lakefront house, Evelyn drafted incorporation papers with the same discipline she had applied to court documentation. There would be a board of trustees, clear bylaws, annual public reporting. Transparency had proven its power in legal defense. It would anchor her philanthropy as well. News of the foundation filing reached her parents indirectly through mutual acquaintances. A brief message arrived from Linda several days later, expressing surprise at the scale of the donation and suggesting that such decisions might warrant family discussion. Evelyn read the message once and set the phone aside. The estate was no longer subject to oversight by those who had questioned her capacity. Her decisions did not require approval from individuals who had attempted to redefine her competence. One evening, as she stood near the wide windows overlooking Lake Michigan, she reflected on the transformation of the past months. The accusation had sought to diminish her authority. The documentation had restored it. Now, the same authority was being directed toward purpose rather than defense. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt scrutinized. It felt reclaimed. Stability had been challenged in a courtroom. It had been confirmed in record. And now, it was being expressed through deliberate action. Evelyn Harper understood that wealth carried responsibility, not to those who sought control, but to the values she and James had shared. And this time, her signature would define the outcome. The incorporation documents for the James Harper Arts Initiative were filed on a clear Monday morning in early January, the kind of morning when Chicago's air felt sharp and deliberate. Evelyn Harper arrived at the state office with a slim portfolio tucked beneath her arm, her steps steady across the polished marble floor. There were no cameras, no audience, only clerks processing forms with routine efficiency. She signed each page carefully, her handwriting even, her decisions final. The foundation would allocate $750,000 in its initial endowment, structured to generate annual grants without compromising the principle. The design was precise, sustainable, transparent. By the time she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the wind off Lake Michigan carried a clean bite, but she did not pull her coat tighter. She felt anchored. Within 2 weeks, the first board meeting convened in the lakefront house's formal dining room. The long mahogany table that had once hosted business partners and family gatherings now held printed mission statements and projected budgets. A retired school principal, a financial advisor, and a local arts curator had agreed to serve as trustees. They reviewed bylaws, voting procedures, and accountability standards with professional focus. Evelyn chaired the meeting without hesitation. Her voice was calm as she outlined James's handwritten notes about cultural access and stability. The board voted unanimously to approve the first grant cycle. $50,000 would be distributed to 3 public high schools lacking dedicated arts funding. There was no applause, no ceremonial gesture. Only signatures placed deliberately at the bottom of official documents. News of the foundation's launch began circulating through civic networks. An article in a local business journal mentioned the initiative as a significant private contribution to arts education. The piece described Evelyn as a philanthropist and estate steward, referencing the recent court findings that had confirmed her financial competence. The language was factual, not dramatic. Yet the shift in public narrative was unmistakable. Stability was no longer being questioned. It was being demonstrated in action. Richard learned of the article before Linda did. He sent a brief email congratulating her on the public relations success, suggesting that perhaps family reconciliation would reflect well on all parties. Evelyn read the message in her study, the afternoon light filtering through tall windows onto the Persian rug. Public relations had not guided her decision. Integrity had. She closed the email without responding. The Foundation's first grant presentation took place in a modest high school auditorium on the city's west side. Students sat in folding chairs while faculty members expressed gratitude for resources that would restore music and visual arts programs. Evelyn stood at the podium only long enough to acknowledge the teachers and emphasize accountability for every dollar allocated. Her remarks were brief, composed, and focused on opportunity rather than personal history. As she stepped down, applause filled the room, not for her vindication, but for possibility. Driving back along Lakeshore Drive that evening, the skyline reflected against the darkening water. Months earlier, her identity had been challenged in a courtroom. Now it was being defined in classrooms. The attempt to question her judgment had inadvertently clarified her purpose. And as the lake's steady waves moved against the shoreline, Evelyn Harper understood that control over wealth was never the true objective. Direction was. By late February, the James Harper Arts Initiative had distributed its first round of grants, and reports from the recipient schools began arriving in structured, detailed summaries. Photographs showed new easels lined against classroom walls, sheet music placed neatly on stands, and students gathered around tables where canvases replaced outdated textbooks. Evelyn Harper reviewed each report at her desk with the same precision she once applied to quarterly investment statements. Every dollar was accounted for, every objective measured. The Foundation's bylaws required written evaluations within 60 days, and the compliance was immediate. Stability, once challenged, was now producing measurable outcomes. One afternoon, as snow fell lightly over Lake Michigan, a formal letter arrived from the State Bar Association. The disciplinary review concerning the financial conduct tied to the guardianship petition had concluded. Without dramatics, the letter stated that ethical violations had been identified in the handling of consulting fees and disclosure requirements. Sanctions would follow. The language was clinical, but the implication carried weight. Professional reputations built over decades had been altered in a single paragraph. Evelyn read the letter once and placed it inside the cabinet beside the panel's conclusion. She did not feel vindictive. She felt resolved. Accountability had moved from accusation to consequence. Later that week, Linda appeared at the lakefront house unannounced. The security system alerted Evelyn before the doorbell rang. Through the foyer camera, she saw her mother standing on the stone steps, coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, expression restrained. Evelyn opened the door without hesitation but did not step aside immediately. The air between them was crisp, more from history than temperature. Linda spoke softly, stating that matters had gone too far and that perhaps pride had clouded judgment. She referenced family reputation and the strain of public scrutiny. Evelyn listened without interruption. When her mother finished, she replied evenly that the review process had followed documented facts. There had been no exaggeration, no retaliation, only response. Linda's eyes searched for visible resentment and found none. What stood before her was not anger. It was clarity. After several moments, Linda asked whether there might be a way forward. Evelyn answered carefully. Trust, once reframed in a courtroom, required more than apology. It required acknowledgement of intent and acceptance of consequence. The conversation ended without raised voices. Linda left as quietly as she had arrived. That evening, Evelyn returned to the study and opened the Foundation's ledger. The second grant cycle was scheduled for approval within 30 days. $750,000 had already begun generating measurable change. The estate remained secure, diversified, intact. Outside, the lake moved steadily beneath a sky turning indigo. Months earlier, an attempt had been made to portray her as incapable of managing complexity. Now complexity was structured under her direction. The house felt different, not because its walls had changed, but because its authority had been reclaimed. Stability was no longer something she defended. It was something she demonstrated through continuity. And continuity, sustained without interruption, had become the quiet answer to every question once raised against her name.